Welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that always checks with the Cabinet Office before we publish an episode. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Like we've just been discussing in our Patreon bonus, I've been to Berlin, which was nice. Saw a lot of history, quite a few things that are probably relevant now, given how many wars we seem to be having going on in the world. So, yeah, I mean, go to Berlin and visit some museums and learn history, I think would be a recommendation if you wanted a TLDR of our chat earlier. We should probably head on into our headlines. Do we have any headlines this week, Rob?
I've gone for I've gone for two main stories instead, if that's okay with you, because I think there are two big things that have happened since you've been away.
I think we just need to kind of, people will see as the show develops that we will touch on some things that have been in the news, obviously. But yeah, it's not like a list of headlines. We're going to go into two stories. So story number one, I think there's been some more by-elections since we last spoke.
There have. They just keep coming. I mean, last time, right at the end of the Labour episode, we talked about by-election that happened in Scotland that was significant. Since then, we've had two more, Tamworth and MidBedfordshire, and we'll go through them one by one, but there might be a couple of names you recognise that hit the larger news, because the reasons why these are by-elections, the people involved were fairly high profile in particularly the Boris Johnson government. So, Tamworth is the first one. That's because MP Chris Pincher has been forced to step down. Now, do you remember who Chris Pincher was and what he did?
I was going to say, I think I remember most importantly that he was known as Pincher by name and Pincher by nature to a certain Boris Johnson, which, probably isn't a good start for an MP. Am I right in thinking, was he chief whip or was about to become chief whip when all these allegations came to light?
Yeah, or at least he was like deputy chief whip. He was very high up in the cabinet structure and should have been somebody who ministers would have been comfortable approaching with sensitive information, including those of any sexual impropriety. So when he himself is accused of that, it was very serious indeed. And because of his high standing in the party and because Boris Johnson backed him and then said he didn't know about the former allegations and then said he might have done and then said, I did know, but I forgot. All of that culminated. It was certainly, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back for most of the Conservative MPs. And essentially, it was that crisis that was the catalyst for the resignation of Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid, and then the ousting of Boris Johnson when it happened very quickly. It was all within a couple of days, and down came the Johnson administration. So it was a quick end for Johnson, but for Pincher, he still had to go through an inquiry, much like the one that Boris Johnson did by the Parliamentary Standards Committee. That inquiry took over a year to do, and as a result, they suggested some suspension measures for Chris Pincher, which, as we've discussed when we were talking about Boris Johnson, if you are suspended from Parliament, then you constituents can launch a recall petition to try and get your seat up for a by-election. So with that threat looming, Chris Pincher decided to fall on his sword and resign instead. And that was what triggered the by-election in Tamworth.
Yeah, so it's kind of continuing our narrative we've had over several of these episodes of comeuppance, I guess, for various high-profile Tories who have done something a bit naughty or worse, a variety of reasons that people have been recalled or have chosen to resign. What do we know about Tamworth? I mean, I only know about it in this context. So it's in Staffordshire. That's a starting point. Mm-hmm. So presumably it was fairly strongly Conservative if it had a deputy chief whip there.
So it's a typical constituency in the sense that it's a little bit of a bellwether, but not particularly. It'd been fairly staunchly Conservative since 2005. So you're looking at somewhere that ever since 2010 and Labour fell out of power, that was the last Labour government, it has returned Conservative majorities. Let's go back in time. So Chris Pincher won it from Labour back in 2010 with 45% of the vote. And ever since then, the majority has just been going up and up and up. And then if you go to the 2019 general election in Tamworth, Labour had 10,000 votes and Chris Pincher got 30,000 votes, over 66% of the vote. So you can see how it was a constituency that had become incredibly safe for the Conservatives. However, as we know from recent by-elections, making it incredibly safe for the Conservatives isn't always a guarantee that it will return their candidate in the result of a by-election. Now, obviously, Chris Pincher wasn't the one who decided to stand in 2023. That honour fell to Andrew Cooper. However, as we've talked before, there are a lot of particularly unique circumstances that can happen around by-elections. Traditionally, turnout is fairly low, and people tend to vote in these to send a message to the government rather than return an MP. They know that in this case, if they get somebody who isn't a Conservative in, Labour aren't suddenly going to be in power, but it will let people know that they're upset with how the Conservatives are governing at the moment.
So, yes, let's look at the results then. So, well, given we're talking about this and continuing our narrative, it may not surprise you that Labour won this by-election, especially given what we've just said about the various things that happen in by-elections. But it is, I think, notable for the swing. So it is, it doesn't sound like a lot when you put it down in numbers, because it's only about 1,300 votes to Labour over the Conservatives. So they have 11,719 to 10,403. And then next down there is Reform UK on 1,000. So basically no one else really competing here. The story that I think is important is the swing. So Labour gets 45.8% of the vote and Conservatives get 40.7%. That is a 22.1% swing to Labour and 25.6% away from the Conservatives. A few of those points have gone to Reform Britain First. So we've discussed this before. There's a few parties that tend to soak up the Conservative vote, but I guess possibly the one of note here, given what we've talked about before, the Lib Dems actually lost 3% here. So it's not going to be it's not one of those Lib Dem Conservative marginals. It is Labour versus Conservative here.
Yeah, totally. And I do think this is a case of the Lib Dems standing aside to try and make sure they could get somebody who wasn't a Conservative in. Lib Dems tend to choose their fights particularly smartly, and they felt that they hadn't had much of a history in this constituency. It is traditionally, as I've said by those results in the past, it was Labour back in 2005. So it is one of those Labour Conservative, not marginals, but that's where you will have the fight. That swing of 23.9% was the second biggest swing from Conservative to Labour since 1945. So that's how astronomical it is. So it's, it still took Labour a lot to try and win this seat, and it had to move a lot of heart and minds to get there. You've also talked about the parties, Lib Dems losing 3%. The party that came in third place was Reform UK. And if you have a quick look at the numbers of votes, so Labour got 11,719, Conservatives 10,403, Reform in third got 1,376. What you can do, or what some people will do, I don't particularly like it, but you can some people say, oh, look, the anti-Conservative vote was higher in this constituency. If you add the Labour and Lib Dem votes up together, that beats the Conservatives, isn't first past the post. Rubbish is usually how the argument goes. In this case, have a look. If the Conservative and Reform UK votes were added together, that would be more than, or at least just more, than the Labour vote that they got in the constituency. So you can see there, even the existence of a party on the right of the Conservatives helped to split the vote enough in this constituency to maybe make sure that Andrew Cooper, the person who was standing for the Tories, didn't get in. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, because people traditionally have talked about how the parties on the left, Labour and Lib Dems, split the vote, and that works in favour of the Tories. In this case, I know it's a very minor split, but you might see it with parties like Reform or like UKIP did in the past. If they start taking votes away from the Conservatives in the next election, that could spell electoral disaster, and then the Conservatives are really in the wilderness looking for which way do they go? Do they go to the centre, or do they go further right to try and appease those who would lend their votes to Reform instead?
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking of a similar point, because one of the criticisms often levelled at the left is that they split their vote between various ideologies within the general, being left part of the spectrum. And the Conservatives generally are the only alternative on the right. So it is, again, interesting to see there's Reform, there's Britain First, there's UKIP, all taking a chunk. And whereas, as you say, the Greens and the Lib Dems have actually lost some of their votes, so those are presumably going to Labour and not Conservatives in this situation. So it is interesting again. And we'll probably come back to this a bit later when we talk about rhetoric being used in public at the moment by certain members of the Conservative Party. You do wonder if people are trying to recapture some of that, which is a problem we essentially led to Brexit the first time round. So yeah, I say the first time round. It was a long running thing where there was a lot of people voting for the BNP and stuff over many years. But yes, that's probably all we have to say on Tamworth. So by-election number 2, please. Mid-Bedfordshire. That sounds like a sleepy part of the kind of home counties that might be rather conservative. That kind of match the constituency up to this point?
It does. So Mid-Bedfordshire has been Conservative since its conception as a constituency in 1918. So if you are talking about safe Tory heartlands, this should be the one. However, it had a slight problem in the fact that the MP for Mid-Bedfordshire was Nadine Dorries. Now, Nads is probably, if you follow the podcast, you'll probably know who she is. She's no shrinking violet, made her mark in the Boris Johnson administration for being the lady with the I Love Boris Johnson t-shirt, he can do no wrong, in the background of every photo, and pining for his attention everywhere he went. This seat became open for a number of bizarre reasons. So whereas Pincher was forced out by a parliamentary standards inquiry, Nadine Dorries resigned. Or did she? She said she was going to resign in the aftermath that we found out that Boris Johnson was going to have a parliamentary inquiry, and she resigned basically in protest of that. But then it turned out that she found out her name wasn't on the running to be one of the on the honours list, basically, to become a lord or a lady in Boris Johnson's sort of last honours list that he puts out before he goes. All resigning prime ministers are allowed to do one of those, and she felt that she had been denied this by some unscrupulous behaviour from within the Conservative Party, that her name had definitely been put down there. Boris Johnson wouldn't have forgotten her, so somebody must have taken it off the list, and that somebody must have been Rishi Sunak, and this has put the two at loggerheads ever since. On top of that, also with her will they, won't they resign sort of going on, because she said she was going to stay around to wait for the results of her inquiry into whether her name had been taken off the honours list by Rishi Sunak. She also didn't appear as an MP in Parliament for, it's well over a year, I think, 18 months. And there was sort of a meme going round during the summer basically saying, where's Nadine? Nobody's spotted her. She hasn't even, not only has she not appeared in Parliament for all this time or spoken on behalf of her constituents, she hasn't even held a surgery. And it was really brought up questions of, MPs are meant to be your representative in Parliament. If she's not performing that function, then should she be in place? It's very odd as well, because the levers that you can pull on in government to try and remove an MP, they are quite limited. Rishi Sunak's Prime Minister, and he can chuck her out of the Conservative Party, but he can't force her to resign her position as MP. That has to be done by either a recall petition that's prompted by a parliamentary inquiry, or the person in question has to resign herself. So it was a little bit of a farce, the will they, won't they. But eventually it came to a head, and she decided that she would step down, and the by-election, which many had thought that she had been saving for just before the Tory party conference in an effort to try and embarrass Rishi Sunak, it ended up happening just afterwards instead.
We've kind of been following this. It's been a slow burn, Nadine Dorries. I think she wanted to publish her book, which is out soon. And it's being serialized in like the Daily Mail or something like that. And that's full of allegations that, if important if true, is how I would summarize that book based on what I've heard about it. And I think that's basically how most of the media are taking it. They're like, well, if you're making these allegations about serious Tory, we've seen a lot of stuff about senior Tories being caught out doing stuff. So it kind of fits that oeuvre of news, but you feel like you'd probably put some more info. I mean, I guess maybe she's spoken to some lawyers who were like, don't say that. But if there are serious allegations to be made, they probably should be made properly and not in a book you're trying to sell.
Yeah, and I've heard people, her book will probably be available in the works for 99p very, very soon. But
yes.
She's, the allegations of all people in the background of the Conservative Party might not like each other very much. I think a lot of people who work within politics have turned around and gone, you think, Nadine? Like, this is just politics. This is just what happens. And for you to try and make a scandal out of how politics works, she might be overblowing it. And I think it's one of those things where she doesn't mind, but it's happened to her. And because it's happened to her, it's now the biggest scandal in the world, and she has to reveal it to everybody. So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think a healthy dose of salt
Yes.
when reading any of her books, her stories in the book. But yes, I guess we have another situation where we've got a by-election. We've just discussed one that was very clearly Conservative Labour, and you talked about how maybe the Lib Dems stood aside a bit, but it didn't seem like they really had much traction there. This seems much more in the Ed Davey driving some kind of large vehicle or hammer through a blue wall kind of constituencies that we have seen go to the Lib Dems before in these by-elections. So is it fair to say this is more of an even fight between the three main parties?
Totally. Yeah, this was a proper three-way battle. Some might have argued that maybe this was one for Labour to stand aside. I've told you the history, right? Labour have never won here in 1918. There's a worry that you can split the vote as well. So if Labour were to stand aside and let the Lib Dems take it, it could be an easy win for the Lib Dems. Ed Davey gets to pop a big blue balloon or, do something along those lines that the Lib Dems always like to do. And everybody can say, goodness me, the Conservatives are being bashed on both sides. But surprisingly, clearly Labour's polling data suggested that it wasn't worth them standing aside, and they did have a chance of winning it, which is high risk. You do, like I say, run the risk of splitting the vote and getting another Conservative MP in there. But clearly they felt they had something there. So if you move on to the results, I think you can let us know what happened.
Yeah, so we had, again, Labour have won this one. So I guess we'll put you out of your misery straight away. Labour won plus 12% of the vote. But interestingly, Lib Dems are in third, but the suspense here, I'm sure, is killing you. They had plus 10.5%. So we can see there that this is much more of a Conservative vote splitting two ways situation. And the Conservatives lost 28.7% and dropped down. So they were 3% behind in the end. So it was 34.1% to Labour, 31.1% to Conservatives, and 23.1% to the Lib Dems. Another thing I think of note is that the Conservative candidate here was less of an unknown than the other one. He was their Police and Crime Commissioner in 2021. And I think there was something about him being like forced out of that position. I forget the exact details, but like when he ran, it was something like when he ran for this position, they were like, well, he can't be Crime Commissioner and MP. So they forced him to resign, even though he hadn't yet won. Like obviously he would have had to resign if he became MP. But they kind of used that as an excuse to force him out. So there's a bit of a hoo-ha around that because it is, he's from Nigeria. And so there was a lot of talk out of, is this racism against our really good Police and Crime Commissioner? So he did sound like a good candidate, but Nadine Dorries has probably made people not very happy with the Conservative Party.
Yes, and I think that's the big problem the Conservatives had to override here, right? Like you say, they went for a candidate who was known locally. They had to do that, I think, after the disconnect that they'd had between Nadine Dorries and the local people. They wanted to put somebody in who said, no, look, this person has been fighting for you, even when Nadine hasn't. This is our man. You should vote for them. But it was, for them to lose that constituency, as I said, which was never been Labour since its conception in 1918, is a huge embarrassment and might show the depths of problems that the Conservative Party have, even in their safest seats. Now, that there is a perfect storm here. I do think the fact that Nadine Dorries was such a poor MP for such a long time, and it generated such a sort of a national fervour around it. Like the story of Nadine Dorries not being a good MP made national news, and Rishi Sunak was being asked about it through the summer. I don't think he was being asked the same questions about Tamworth. So you get that there was sort of like a bigger spotlight on this election. So for me, if I was to say who was to blame for the Conservatives' loss in this constituency, I would firmly point the finger of blame at Nadine Dorries for this one. However, this hasn't stopped her from, because Nadine Dorries has her own TV segment on Talk TV, which I had a little listen to last week, where she comes in a big hot dog car, dressed as a hot dog, in true Tim Robbins style, saying, we all want to find out who did this. We all want to know who did this. We need to work out who lost this. And I think I've worked it out. It's definitely Rishi Sunak's fault, and she blames Rishi Sunak to the hilt for the failure, which is maybe unsurprising given that she has quite a lot of personal beef and she hasn't been shy in saying that. But it does show the other problem the Conservatives have that might feed in well to the next story that we have. But the splits that are happening, the infighting within the Conservative Party, is also a massive disadvantage for them now. Even if you are Team Boris or Team Rishi, if you're Team, Nadine, whatever you feel, there are factions within that Conservative Party that mean people are confused about what they stand for and what the direction is. And I think that's something that Rishi Sunak, we mentioned it at the party conference season, that more is being said about the people on the sidelines than his core speech itself. And I feel that, that hasn't been a good factor for him. And that's why they suffered in Mid-Bedfordshire so badly.
And I think it's also worth noting this was very Conservative, first non-Conservative MP since 1918. I guess what we're going to do now is our usual bit of what does this mean for a general election? You've touched on it a little bit, but we have also mentioned previously by-elections. They're not the same as a general election. They tend to be for specific reasons where people may choose not to vote for the party, to show the party that caused the big problem, whatever that problem is, that they weren't doing a good job. People may take their vote away from them. Maybe the question to ask you is, how likely do you think it is that Labour will hold on to both of these come the general election?
So I do think it's very unlikely that they will hold on to both. Tamworth in particular seems to have been that it was really quite close for them in the end, and the Conservatives might feel they can, under better circumstances, take that back. Mid-Bedfordshire as well, unless they have a look and they decide that they're going to stand aside, or they're going to let the Lib Dems fight that one equally. They'll struggle to keep those seats because I think it is just a flash in the pan. The other thing that doesn't help in these elections, and as every Conservative on the television the day after these by-elections came out, they kept saying the turnout's very low, Conservative voters just stayed at home, and we're confident that they will come out and vote for us come a proper general election, which is maybe true, but you've got to worry that they stay at home for these elections where it's clear that it will be a national embarrassment. And if nothing changes, if things change for the worse even, or they lose even more faith in Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party, then it's still an uphill battle for the Conservatives there as well. So it's really good news for Labour, in particular Starmer, I think, where people have always sort of had a question mark over Starmer, saying, he really should win, but can he win these elections? Results like these, where they're by-elections that they were no sure thing. Sometimes you get by-elections where there's a very, if there was a margin of 2%, if Labour just needed a 2% swing towards them, you'd expect them to get it easily. And particularly when Boris Johnson was in charge post-2019, you had some people where they were having by-elections then that the Conservatives were winning, and Boris Johnson said, look, we've been in power for so long and we're still winning these by-elections. Isn't that good that we can keep on winning? There's none of that now. There's absolutely no sign of that. It's got to be a worry for them, and a really good sign for Labour. The other really good sign for Labour, and I've put a link there, so I don't know if you want to drop that in the show notes, but I think this is fascinating. So most parties for a general election will have a list of target seats, and the easiest way to look at what seats you should target is to look at the difference in the vote percentage from last year. So what's the minimum amount of swing? So if I have a look at this website, right up the top is Bury North, that Labour lost by 105 votes. So they only need a swing of 0.11% to turn that seat from blue to green. Now, the swing that we had in these elections was up at 22% in Tamworth, and it was a swing of 12% in Mid-Bedfordshire. Look how far down the list you need to go. How many seats Labour will win until you get to a 12% swing? If they get a 12% swing, they win 141 of their target seats that are no longer Conservative or Green or SNP. Those go straight to the Labour Party, which would mean a landslide, 22. And I don't think the list even goes down that far. Yeah, 22, they win.
250 seats. Yeah, it's a lot of seats.
So we've talked about some electoral models maybe not being the most reliable, and some work on swing, and they just take a very basic maths calculation across the country and bodge it into your thing. That's where you have those weird. That's why you have those predictions of Labour, like getting plus 400 seats and the Conservatives being reduced to 25. Silly things like that because of these type of results you're getting in by-elections. So all Keir Starmer has to do at the next general election is say, look, I only need a swing of half that. I need a swing of 5%, 6%. A swing of 6% wins him 72 of these target seats and gets him a majority, right? So if you're thinking about risk management, if you're thinking about what's happened in these, and if you're trying to extrapolate that data to other ones, then it's looking extremely good for Labour with any election on the horizon. And again, the Conservatives have got to be scratching their heads. What do they do to try and stop these big swings, particularly towards Labour? I think the fact that Labour were able to win Mid-Bedfordshire as well and it didn't go to the Lib Dems should worry the Conservatives even more, because that means that Labour might have a even bigger majority if they can take seats off the Lib Dems as well, potentially.
Yeah. And I think I just, every time we look at it, it just seems like it's going to be very, very bad for the Conservatives. And I guess that's what happens when you've held on to power for 13, 14 years. It's just going to happen. There's almost an inevitability to it.
Yes. I mean, there is, like, it's silly. Some people, I've talked to a lot of people just say, oh, it's not the Conservatives' time in power. It can't be. And I get that to a point. You do get some, like, there are some natural cycles where things break down. People aren't as popular as before. But Conservatives had a couple of opportunities to reinvent itself over the last 10 years. If you think of all the different prime ministers, all the different styles they've tried, they could have. Imagine if you'd had 10 years of David Cameron that transitioned into Boris Johnson and you had 10 years of Boris Johnson, right? It's not, in my mind, that's not unfathomable to say that you have two very different styles of conservatism that could have bled into one another, because you can adapt that style. The problem the Conservatives have is they've done everything on fast forward, and it's really sort of collapsed at the end. So, change is there, and people do tend to change their minds, but it's not inevitable. There are plenty of examples throughout the world. I think Japan is one example where the Liberal Party ruled for years and years and years and years and years and years in a pure democracy. We're talking about, not like somewhere where Vladimir Putin stays in power a long time and lots of people vote for him. Weird. You do get examples of established democracies in the world where parties can change and adapt with the times and always keep in power. But it's certainly not looking likely that the Conservatives will be able to adapt or get out of this one in a pinch.
Yeah. So I guess I don't have much more to say on that. We should probably, we'll head into the polls at the end, but surprise, surprise, I don't think it's going to be much different to what we're seeing in our previous polls. But we have another story we need to deal with. So I guess this is kind of a bit like a set of mini headlines this week. And that is talking about, where could the Conservative Party go? How could they reinvent themselves to maybe, be a proper threat to Labour, if assuming Labour wins the general election? Who might want to be the next leader of the Conservative Party? And so I guess we have to talk about Suella Braverman. What's going on there?
What is
it's been a lot the last few days.
It has, and so I find this weird. I've been looking at my notes here. Suella is a problem, and maybe we should just underline that and leave that here, because she's a problem for, I don't know, society at large and some of the rhetoric that she has, but she's also a big problem for Rishi Sunak. So let's break that down a little bit. So Suella has been a figure in government ever since, I think, the Boris Johnson administration, and I think people kind of saw it as a Priti Patel light in a way. Like, you forget, but Priti Patel was front and centre of the Boris Johnson government as Home Secretary in the same role that Suella has now. Suella was originally Attorney General because she's got a background in law. You talk to most lawyers, they don't respect her background in law, but she does have a background in law nonetheless. So she was part of the Johnson administration. That went down. Then she was part of the Truss administration, and I don't know if you remember, but she managed to get herself fired from that voluntarily. She kind of said, oh, whoopsie, I'm very, very sorry, but I've accidentally sent an email to somebody I haven't. I have to resign, which people sort of saw through as that seems particularly minor. You could have not owned up to that and got away with it. We suspect that a lot of MPs are doing this all the time. You seem to be resigning to cause a problem for Liz Truss, and in that, Liz Truss resigned within 2 days of Suella Braverman basically resigning her post as well. So I think some of that might have gone to her head. She's quite ambitious, as you've said. You've talked about like leadership ambitions. One thing I will always remember about her before she sort of shot to prominence in this role is as Attorney General when she was under Boris Johnson. Do you remember when things were going really badly for Boris Johnson? Sunak resigned, Javid resigned, and that night there was just a slow trickle of ministers and junior ministers going out the door. So I turned on Robert Peston, and Suella is there. She's still a cabinet minister. And Robert Peston sort of turns around to Suella and says, "Do you think this is the end for Boris Johnson? Do you think it is?" And she goes, "Yeah, I think it is. And just now, I'd just like to say that because it's definitely the end for him, I'd like to throw my hat into the ring to be the next Conservative leader." And Robert Peston kind of looks at her and goes, "Sorry, but you're a serving cabinet minister. You haven't resigned yet. Why do you think you can say that? Because that's like, you can't do both, right? You can't be in the cabinet and say, I'm going to be the next minister and the current prime minister is rubbish." And she kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, "Well, look, somebody's got to be Attorney General. It's very unlikely he's going to fill the position. So for the good of the country, I'll stay in this. But yeah, I don't think he's up to much." And that, for me, undermined the entire sort of philosophy of what she's done. She doesn't seem to care about traditional cabinet standards if it means that she can advance her position. Now, I don't think she even ran, did she, against in the Liz Truss Rishi Sunak thing? I can't remember. So the link I have shared, I should have shared 2 links. We've got SuellaForLeader.com, so she did run for leader, and a clip of the great skills and talents of Suella. For the charisma that she shows is incredible in that clip. So we'll talk about it. But yeah, let me know when you are ready to jump back in.
Oh my gosh. I almost can't finish watching that. Like the last 20 seconds. I'm like, oh, this is worse than did you threaten to overrule him?
Yes.
Yeah, strong, that vibe. Okay. So yeah, I've also posted a thing that I just saw, which ties into a story that was on Newscast. Okay. So maybe we can bring all of that together.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So where did we just got to?
So did she run for the Conservative leadership?
Yeah. So she ran for the Conservative leadership against I can't remember well, you've probably looked this up, Rob, but when did she drop out of that race?
So she dropped out in the second round of voting, so she didn't get very far. She didn't even get to there was a stage where it was the final 5 where they all had to go up on stage and be in the debates. She didn't go to the mansion with Simon Cowell, any of that, so she all just stayed in the background there. I've got her old website up, and maybe this gives there's a couple of clues into where she sits in the Conservative Party. So my plan to get us back on track: cut taxes. So that's big Liz Truss energy there, must cut taxes. Control our borders. Again, that's kind of like Brexity things. We can't have the European Court deciding who can stay in our country. End identity politics. We need common sense approach that lets teachers get on with teaching. So a good bit of right-wing culture war thrown in there for good measure to make that one of her core points. And then the other one was enact the manifesto. We must deliver for the voters to avoid an early general election, which essentially translates to I liked Boris Johnson. I liked everything he did. I want to carry on doing that, please, and make sure that we can keep our majority, because that seemed to get us a good majority. And the campaign is promoted by Steve Baker, who some of you might know as being another core Brexiteer. He's one of the members of the ERG, the European Research Group, which is sort of a core group of MPs, backbench MPs, that really pushed for that vote on European membership, and they got their wish. And ever since then, they've been a bit of a thorn in the leader of the Conservative Party side, especially Theresa May. They're arguably the group that brought down that government as well. So they have previous in this. The only funny thing is, and I've shared that clip, which you've now watched, if you want to know who the members of the ERG are, Suella was quizzed on this by Christian Guru Murphy, on Channel 4, and it's a little bit of car crash television where she announces proudly that the public funds the ERG. We're a group of MPs, and Christian Guru Murphy responds by saying, okay, who is in this mysterious group of MPs that's leading everything? And she dances around the question like there's no tomorrow, eventually conceding that maybe she can get a list for him if he asks for it nicely. But yeah, I do encourage you to look at the clip yourself. So, ambitious member of the Conservative Party, certainly on the right, very Brexity, but might not have all the charisma in the world. That's sort of a general picture of where she is in the background.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out as well that she has. We discussed a bit when Liz Truss was there that she was previously a Lib Dem and slowly fell over to being a Conservative. It seems Suella has always been, or at least as an adult, has always been a Conservative Party member. And there's another link that will also be in the show notes of a story of her as a member of the Conservative club at university that were also involved in corruption and stuff. And this was mentioned on Newscast, I think on the last episode, because one of the BBC political editors went to university at the same time as her, and he was in the newspaper club and she was in the Conservative club. And he's like, our positions have not changed since we were at university, basically, which was quite amusing. But yeah, I'm not a fan of Suella Braverman is probably the nicest way I can describe my feelings about her. And I think we probably need to talk about like some of the stuff she's saying. Like, so, you know, we know she's tried to run before. She's very ambitious. How is she? What has she spun in the last few months? And you know, how has she got to here? And then, like, why do we think she's maybe trying to challenge Rishi Sunak? What's going on there? What's been going on? Because the last week has been story after story, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the time I edit this, she's been sacked or maybe not. It's very confusing. Yeah.
So she's bubbling up. So clearly she has weight within a influential group within the Conservative Party, the ERG. So that's somebody that you want to keep on side. And it is said, it is rumoured, at least from people on newscasts have said this, and I think they're a fairly reliable source, that when you had the leadership election after Liz Truss went, and it was Rishi Sunak against somebody else, maybe Penny Mordaunt, but Penny couldn't get the signatures. There was a worry that Boris Johnson might come back and throw his hat into the ring again. It was Suella Braverman and that group of people who said, look, Rishi, we'll back you and not Boris to make sure that you become leader. However, you have to make me Home Secretary. So that's the deal we believe was struck. So traditionally, she might not have got in Rishi Sunak's cabinet at all, but in order to try and, you know, when you build these cabinets, they're kind of, you have to build coalition within your party. You have to have different wings of your party represented. She represents a fairly powerful or influential wing of that party. So that's why she's been brought into a high, you know, a place of high office, Home Secretary. So she's there. She's got the platform now to say what she wants. Say what she wants within reason. She's still a cabinet minister and should still abide by the principles of cabinet. That is important to remember. She's been making headlines by basically saying the things that Rishi Sunak doesn't want to say. Like, Rishi Sunak wants to present himself as fairly middle of the road, a break from Boris Johnson. Suella wants to present herself as the right of the party and try and appeal to those people who might vote for reform, essentially. GB News, that kind of crowd, that's who she's appealing to. So she was very vocal on her support for Rwanda, and that's a decision that the European High Court or even the UK High Court might strike down as unconstitutional. She'll be against that, and she'll probably fight it, and she'll use some very fierce language. When she was Home Secretary and she was talking about the right of protest, she called left-wing protesters Guardian reading, tofu eating wokerati, which
a name so good that I had it as my Discord username on a UK politics server for several months.
Yeah. So she knows who she's she knows who she's preaching to. That's a line that you would hear on GB News, right? But it feels ridiculous in everyday speech. That's who she was talking to within that speech. But of course, it caused a bit of a ruckus because generally politicians don't go that hard or fast when talking about that. At the recent Conservative Party conference, we touched on it there. Her speech, most controversially, she talked about a hurricane of migrants coming into the country and that the Conservatives have been too soft on immigration for years. it was pretty powerful rhetoric that some said was bordering on, incredibly right wing and even sort of hate speech. That's the type of stuff she's always willing to go that little bit further than most MPs are to try and make headlines. And this is a tactic that a lot of right wing politicians and like media figures use. You don't want to be ignored. You don't want to be bland. You've got to say the mad things to get noticed, because even if they're abhorrent, everybody talks about you and you get your name noticed. So I think it's fair to say that she has made a name for herself with these statements. It's not necessarily a good reputation, but she is known throughout the country. A little bit like, Priti Patel rose to prominence because of some of the things that she said. Suella is sort of trying to follow that career path in a way. And so most recently, and we're now on to this week, if you're keeping up with the bingo card of mad things that Suella has said, she had a go at that group that's been having it easy for far too long. Yes, that's right, the homeless. She was saying that charities should be fined if they give them tents. The reason that homeless people aren't allowed tents, I'm not quite sure. They look ugly? Is that what she was saying? I can't remember why, but she really didn't like tents and homelessness. And I think the quote that most people took from her speech about that was she said that homelessness was a lifestyle choice, which offended a lot of people because they said not many people choose to be homeless. It is like you're at your lowest point if you happen to find that happening to you. So
I think I might go so far as to argue that no one chooses to, like, I guess you could maybe argue that some people who are in a very bad situation at home are choosing to escape that situation, but that is tenuous at best. That's them being forced out of their home. That's what's happening there.
Exactly. They're still some of the most vulnerable people in society as well. Definitely. So putting them in your crosshairs is bizarre. Not quite sure how that's a vote winner, but it does certainly put her on like the right of the Conservative Party. So
just on the point of vote winning there, the other thing that's been pointed out is it is obviously homelessness is a thing that affects the whole of the UK, but the specific thing about like tents and stuff seems to be very kind of London focused, because there have been these areas of like underpasses and stuff in London where people go because it's sheltered. And I think people maybe think about that more. Like, the average person in the middle of the countryside is unlikely to come across, it's not like there's tents on farmers' land and stuff like this, right? That she's trying to. So it's almost, she's like not really talking to her base that much either, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it seems to be.
My thoughts aren't fully formed on this.
No, but that's fair. I don't think it seems to be controversy for the sake of controversy. It gets mentioned, but it drives, particularly like it drives a wedge. And why it's a problem is that she's saying something, and then you'll cut to a Conservative minister or the Prime Minister, and somebody, a journalist or Keir Starmer, they can forensically come in and say, your Home Secretary said this horrible, horrible thing. Would you agree with this horrible thing? Because as a cabinet, you're all meant to be together and united, and you're all meant to believe in the same thing. And she is the Home Secretary. So have you told her to be really harsh on homeless people, or has she gone rogue? And that forces the PM, in this case, Rishi Sunak, into a really uncomfortable position, because either he has to double down and say, yes, I agree with her 100%, but I just don't say that things, and I've never had this thought before. Or he has to say no, and if he says no, then the question arises, why have you got her in the cabinet if she's just allowed to say whatever she wants? So that's homelessness. She then decided to take on an even more controversial talking point, which is the current war between Israel and Palestine that is happening in the Middle East. So a bit of background behind the specific thing that Suella was talking about. There is a planned protest march that is going to happen on Remembrance Sunday.
Just to be clear,
yeah,
the march is happening tomorrow, Saturday the 11th, which is Armistice Day. However, it's not happening anywhere near the Cenotaph, and not on the day when everyone will be at the Cenotaph, because that's Sunday. So just to be clear, I don't even know why she's jumped on this, because the event's happening a day before the thing everyone's worried about.
Yeah.
But yes.
Thank you for that clarification, because the way everybody was talking about it, I thought it was on the same day as I thought it was on Remembrance Sunday. But no, I get what you mean. It's on the 11th is tomorrow. So yes, it would be on Remembrance Day, but not on the actual day where everything happens. there has been some controversy over this march, particularly stirred up by right-wing papers. I think Sarah Vine, who writes in the Daily Mail, it was on their front pages a couple of days ago, essentially saying that it's terrible that this protest can go ahead. Sarah Vine's words were sort of like, these are protesters that support terrorism, they support Hamas, and I don't think that that's quite true. There's a lot of, we can get, I don't want to get drawn into that conversation on here, but the Met's position, or at least that of the London police, is that you can't stop protests because of who people are. People have a right to protest, and we will manage that. Suella, as the Home Secretary, in her article, disagreed with this somewhat, saying that she claimed that the police gave preferential treatment to some causes over others, saying that the right were met with a stern response, whilst pro-Palestinian mobs were largely ignored. She also picked up on, she said that, police came down hard on lockdown protesters, but were fine with Black Lives Matter protests that happened during the time of COVID, and even bent the knee to those protesters, etc., etc. So she is, once again, I think, quite clearly using the language and elements of the culture war to whip people up, kind of get more of a culture war around this aspect, and possibly whip up a frenzy around it. Now, it's so controversial because as Home Secretary, it should be her job to, one, enforce the law, which in this case is peaceful protest is allowed, so therefore it should be able to go ahead, and two, back what the police are saying, because she is the ultimate, almost like as Home Secretary, you're the highest representative that the police have, or you should be, you set their policy. So to sort of come out so blatantly and say, I think you're biased and not doing a very good job, and you're specifically biased against right-wing causes, that to me is also particularly inflammatory. And this article that was published in the Times with these views was most importantly not amended after Number 10 saw it. Number 10 said they saw it, requested that she make some changes to it. Those changes were ignored, and the article was published anyway. So when you think of it in that context, you've gone to your boss, completely ignored them and done your own thing. That's just showing disrespect to the Prime Minister. And that's why a lot of people are looking at it and going, how can she still be Home Secretary? How can Rishi Sunak allow that to happen when not only does she seem to have been broken her own ministerial code of conduct, but she is directly undermining the Prime Minister in this way?
I think one thing that's been kind of, at least the rhetoric I've seen on Twitter, and that's not the best place to go, but I'm still on there. I won't call it X. I've seen a lot of people talking about how, Sunak is being weak in this situation. Because so far he's basically said, yeah, no, it's fine. And it's like, it's not fine. She keeps breaking the ministerial code and she needs to go. Well, actually, maybe that's incorrect. I'm not sure if this is exactly breaking the ministerial code, but like you say, it's essentially undermining him, and she should go. But yes, it's very much, can't believe she's not gone yet. There was so yesterday they were like, no, she's not going anywhere. And then today there was rumor that that there will be a reshuffle of the cabinet, but we haven't seen it. So until we see it, I won't believe it. Yeah. And Labour's marketing team, PR team, whatever you call them, is having a lot of fun with some very bad photoshops. So yeah, I'll just describe this. It'll be in the show notes, but the word spineless, but they've turned Rishi Sunak into the S using the morph tool, and then Suella's just in the bottom right-hand corner there. What a time to be alive. Do you think she's trying to get fired? Like, it seems like it. If under any normal circumstances, she'd be gone, right? There's no way you'd get away with this.
Yeah, I do think that there is an element there of like, fire me and I become a martyr for my cause, right? There's almost like a contradiction at the heart of some conservative politics, I feel, where they are the ones in power, but they always have to present themselves as the undefined, as the silent majority, right? Everybody believes with me, but we just can't find the people who believe it with me, but they all do, and everybody's out to get me. We are the most powerful people, but also the most under threat because everybody wants to take it away from us. And she represents sort of that hard right wing of the party in that sense. And she wants to be struck down by the big bad government, by the blob, by those people in charge. because that boosts her brand, right? All of a sudden, yeah, I tried to speak the truth and they shot me down. I'm being silenced. Read all about how I'm being silenced in my new book and podcast and TV series. We've seen this play before a lot on the right now. We all know the script by now, and she is trying to follow that to the letter. So Rishi Sunak is trying to avoid firing her and making her a martyr, but also every time that she's in the Conservative Party and he doesn't do it, A, he looks weak, so you get those like Labour memes, and B, does she really, if he agrees with her, if he's just forced to agree with her every time she opens her mouth and says something mad, is he really the leader anymore, or is he being led by what she says on a whim? There's no good scenario for Rishi Sunak in this situation, and that's why it's so tricky, and that's why Labour in particular are going after it. They see it as a sign of weakness. They see it a way of splitting the Conservative Party. And for journalists and those people, it's their job, but they're just confused. Like, there's quite a muddled, who is in charge is the big question that the journalists will be asking. Are you subject to the whims of Suella and whatever she says, or are you your own man, in which case put the boot in and get rid of it? So it's, quite the pickle for Rishi. I think that leads us on to like the next point then, which I've been musing on my mind, and I don't think lots of people have thought about.
I don't think people have taken it seriously. So for the benefit of the people listening to the podcast, the question for us is, would she make a good leader?
Yeah, because
I'm going to put my vote in the no column straight away, but maybe you've got more reasons than that. I must say part of that is a knee-jerk reaction. I think maybe your view might be a bit more measured. Maybe you've got some data points that show why she might not be good at leading the party specifically, as opposed to just me being like, I don't like her politics and she shouldn't be there. I mean, Trump managed to win an election and lead the Republicans, so...
Mine is kind of on vibes as well. I'm not going to lie, but I feel like they're vibes based on science. So let me try and explain that for a while, okay? So somebody else who kind of did this strategy, but not really, was Boris Johnson, right? So Boris Johnson was put into the cabinet by Theresa May after he was stabbed in the back by Michael Gove and couldn't run for leader after Brexit. Theresa May took over. She saw that Boris Johnson would be a big external threat if he was allowed to wallow on the backbenches. So she brought him in and gave him a very big role. In that case, it was Foreign Secretary. But eventually, he misbehaved. He misbehaved too much, or really didn't do his job, to the point where she was forced to get him out of that position, right? And in doing so, he did exactly what she was trying to avoid in the first place, kind of organised a coup, made it really difficult for her to get a more moderate Brexit deal through, was able to construe politics so one, he could become the leader and then get the general election he wanted and become the Brexit saviour. Okay? Fantastic. Boris Johnson, though, was Boris Johnson. And by that, I mean he was popular before that fact, right? You think before Brexit and how popular he was amongst the general population because of the London Olympics, because of going on Have I Got News for You. He was liked. He consistently polled very highly in the list of people who they thought would be good to have prime minister, okay? And you can judge the merit of that, but there was no doubt that he was popular amongst the general populace. And that's kind of why the Conservative Party decided to march to the beat of his drum, right? It was said that he wasn't very popular within the party itself, and when it turned out he'd been incompetent for a while, or they'd had enough of all his shenanigans, the party eventually turned on him and got rid of him, right? But they went along with him for a while. Suella is popular amongst the ERG, but I don't think she's popular within the party, and I don't think she's very popular amongst the general British public either. She is trying to carve out a niche for herself, fair enough, but she's not Boris Johnson. She doesn't have the charisma, the style, she doesn't have a strong ministerial record of success in any of the positions that she's been in. She was a fairly unimpressive Attorney General, and when she was now Home Secretary, all she's done is say controversial things rather than get things done. It looks like the Rwanda plan is going to be overturned by the UK High Court, so that's another big idea torpedoed. And I want to compare it in a way to Liz Truss and the dangers the Conservatives have of putting all their weight behind Suella. So I'm going to compare her to Liz Truss in a way, because you'll remember during that leadership contest, Liz Truss was presented to us as the new Thatcher, right? She dressed like Thatcher for one of the events. She was hard on
cosplayed as Thatcher. I would say.
Cosplayed as dressed as Thatcher. bit strong, isn't it? She cosplayed as Thatcher. It was weird. She kind of did her own ladies not for turning bits. Yes, I'm very, very strong. Rah, rah, rah. I'll cut taxes. The Conservative Party kidded themselves into believing that they had the next Thatcher on their hands. And then when they got her, when they put her in front of the camera, she was rubbish. And people very, very quickly saw through that. And because of her lack of style, charisma, ability, it all fell apart super, super quick, right? So if Suella does the same and suddenly rises to the ranks of Conservative Party leader, because there are some suggesting, I saw this on Channel 4, and I do think this is very unlikely, but there are some suggesting that maybe there could be a bid for the leadership before the next general election. They could look to oust Rishi Sunak and put her in. There might be votes of no confidence going in. They think they can do that and get her appointed. I just think it's going to fall apart just as quickly as Liz Truss's administration did, or at least you will see through it. She's not Boris Johnson. She's not all that. I just have no faith in her in being a good leader. No matter the mad stuff she says, that's by the by, right? Like, I just think fundamentally, as a minister, as a person who would be put in charge of anything, I don't think she's capable of it. And I know that's harsh. I know that sounds super, super harsh. But I saw it coming with Liz Truss, and I can feel the vibes are really, really strong with her as well. That clip that I showed you on Channel 4 News, I think that the similarities are there.
I mentioned to you after you showed me that clip earlier that it has a strong "did you threaten to overrule him" vibe from that famous political moment. But she was just even worse at responding, and just like, and I think there's this kind of training they have, at least in the Conservative Party at the moment, where they're like, oh, just say the same thing over and over again. And it doesn't work in front of actual journalists. It might work in front of GB News, but it doesn't work in front of real journalists. So yeah, it's ridiculous to. And if you're getting up in front of the House of Commons doing stuff like that, because that's was almost kind of how Boris did stuff in front. And it would be nice if Prime Minister's Questions Time can stay like actually a reasonable part of debate. I haven't actually watched much with Sunak, but at least it feels like he does try to answer a bit more.
Yeah, he does. And I think comparing that to what Suella does, she's the shadow Home Secretary is Yvette Cooper. And whenever those two come head to head, Yvette Cooper destroys Suella Braverman. I'm not just using that as like a YouTube clickbait title, Liberal destroys Conservative in debate. She goes for the throat, and Suella doesn't really have much of an answer to it. She's not very good in the House of Commons and on that block when she's up against anybody who's willing to sort of say, you said this, but do you really mean it? And are you willing to say it in the place where you aren't allowed to tell a lie? Like, she's hard in that, which as a lawyer is what you're meant to be able to do, right? She was a lawyer. She's meant to construe arguments where you can technically say something that's true if you look at it from the right light, and I won't be accused of lying in Parliament, but she just struggles with that as well. So at every facet that she could become leader of the Conservative Party, I don't think she's up to it. The only thing she is good for is saying some mad stuff that gets airtime on GB News. And if you want that as a leader, that is a bold strategy for the new direction of the Conservative Party.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it won't work.
No, it won't work.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have much else to add. I think I've made my opinion fairly plain. I think your analysis was definitely more in depth than me just being like, no thanks. We've had enough of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Down with this sort of thing.
Down with this sort of thing.
So we don't have much time left in this show, but we should wrap it up with the polls, which we've already alluded to. Let's have a look at our general election predictor and the polls. So I generally start with the poll of polls just to see where things are going, get a vibe check, as the kids would say. So when did we last talk? We probably Labour had a tiny dip, but is back to where it was. So when we spoke in kind of mid-October, Labour was at 46%. Labour is still at 46%. There was a bit of a wibble in the middle, but the thing that's interesting is it wasn't a wibble towards the Conservatives. The Conservatives, when Labour are at 45, the Conservatives are at 25%. Before that, they were at 26, and they're now down. It's still 25, but it's definitely a downward trend. So I think there was a bit of a bump for the Lib Dems, which might have been around those by-elections, actually. And just having a look. Everyone else is vaguely staying the same. Reform had a bit of a bump as well. So I guess that also explains some of the loss to Conservatives. So, yeah. Labour 46%, Conservatives 25%, Lib Dems 10%, Reform 7%, and Greens 6%. But as we know, that the Greens are only getting one MP out of that, and Reform's vote is spread so thin, they're unlikely to get anyone in the same case that we've had before with those kind of parties. So, yeah. Not much change, really. But I think the general election prediction would have been updated since we last spoke, and things have got worse for the Conservatives since then. So let's have a look. So it was 1st of November. So this is relatively fresh because it only gets updated once every month. So current prediction is a Labour majority of 236, which is not far off that kind of 250 seats. You said 140, right? If they got to 12%, and then you essentially double that because, that's what they're taking away from the Conservatives for the most part. There'll obviously be some bits where Lib Dem and SNP are losing seats instead. But yeah, a majority of 236. That is a stonking majority, as I think we've discussed before. And the predicted seats for the Conservatives would be 133, which is nothing really in the grand scheme of things. Low seats predicted for the Conservatives, 49, which is that the lowest it's been? It might be. We had one where it was very low as well, and they had a big dip.
Liz Truss was lower.
Yeah.
Liz Truss was definitely lower.
Liz Truss, I would like to see as an anomaly. I feel like since we've been looking at under Sunak, I think that might be one of his lower ebbs.
It is, and obviously, like all of this podcast you can take as a whole is like why things are going bad for the Conservatives, and all of that. But I think if I'm gonna end this on a note of like specifically why this is bad for Sunak and why the Suella thing is a particular pinch point, right? And why you're seeing the dip there is that Rishi Sunak's brand when he came in was sort of, look, we had the disarray of Boris Johnson and then the even bigger disarray of Liz Truss. Now I'm in charge. I'm sensible. I'm kind of in the middle. I'm going to listen to everybody, but we're going to no more fighting, right? No, the Conservatives don't fight anymore. We're together. You're behind me until the next general election because we can't go through this again because you saw how many people we lost along the way from going from Johnson to Truss to me, right? There was a huge dip with Liz Truss, and some people came back to Rishi because he seemed to be getting it back on track, or like a little bit. At least we could patch over some of the cracks. If Suella splits the party, or if they go for another leadership election, or there's another vote in no confidence, but he's still leader, where does that leave Rishi Sunak? Where does that leave anybody going into the next election? You've got a prime minister who is going to be undermined by his own party on day one. That's why it is such a big issue having these sort of people in the party. And if his sort of like backdoor solution that I think has been presented, which is, oh, she's not fired, she just got reshuffled into the job of nothing, or she refused to take up this junior position that we gave her instead. I don't think that's gonna fly. So yeah, bad times for the Conservative.
I just went and had a look at the historical view here. And I say historical, I mean a year ago when Sunak came in, as we were just, October, November last year. So other than his initial starting point, which was low thanks to Liz Truss, at 22% for the Conservatives, once he had his little bump of about 5%, he's basically in the position he was at the start of 2023, which is 25%. It's not really gone any lower than that. But, it has been slightly higher at various points. They got up to a whole 29% at one point. But yeah, that Labour is holding strong at this higher position that they've kind of settled down to post Liz Truss. And similarly, the Conservatives are kind of holding at this lower level. And there's a bit of movement in the other parties. Yeah.
It's the Conservatives seem to have
on the way out, right? We know we're going to be saying this several times in the run up to the general election. Money's on maybe a general election being in about a year because there was a King's speech. There were some things in it. Wasn't a lot of things really. Quite a few of them were repeated. It didn't feel like enough really to fill a year, but presumably with campaigning and stuff, it will be about a year at this point. No one, like we said, no one wants a general election in December if they can avoid it, really. Is it worth it to hold on for 2 more months? Probably not when you know you're going to lose. And there have been various articles coming out saying that essentially Sunak's the only person really putting in any work anymore, as all the various ministers know that they're not going to be around for much longer. So, long-term planning is not really on the horizon for them.
Yeah, that's the kind of sign that the ship is sinking and the rats are trying to find a way out. It's you talk about that number not really moving. It's an electoral floor, you would call it, right? Like every kind of like there's always going to be a floor and a ceiling for each type of voter, as in the Conservatives they can alienate this people, but there are still 1 in 5 people that will always vote Conservative no matter what. It's bred into them. They're an established political party, and probably the same goes for Labour. So to be hovering around about that 25% mark is, that's about your floor. You're as low as you can go. Things can get really, really bad if you were to cross it up again, because I think they really did find how bad they could make it for everybody. But with just a competent leader in Sunak, and I mean that by like he tries to follow parliamentary procedure and doesn't get in any way. He's seen as like a middleman in that sense. The fact that they are just chugging along like that and not seeing any big upturn, that's why people are getting nervy. That's why some people are seeing Suella as like the shot in the arm, to be like, hey, if we roll the dice again, maybe we can get those reform people on side, and we shoot up by 5 points, then 10 points, we take some people away from Labour. That's how we win. Culture war, baby. Yeah. But I don't think that's going to
said no Austin Powers.
Said no Austin Powers. Yeah. Clip that.
He was all about being. Yeah. He was all about being groovy, baby.
Exactly.
That sounds fairly damning to me for the Conservative Party, but that shouldn't be surprising given the polls and where we are in kind of the general electoral cycle and all of that. So I guess, you can find us in all our usual places. You can find us, you can still find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter. I won't call it X, at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and if you go to parliamentary.observer, it will take you to our website where you can find these episodes. You can discuss them on there directly. And given social media is a bit of a dumpster fire nowadays, it's probably the best place to go. And of course, if you feel what we do is worthwhile and you want to help fund, web hosting, microphones, that kind of stuff, or if you want to listen to Rob and I chatting about life and other things, which is a bonus thing we do for as little as $1 a month, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/TTSS. And having said all of that, there's nothing else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Rishi. Bye, Suella. Bye.